Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today for Knowledge Bites. I have Paul Stewart here with Oswego Renaissance Association, and he is going to be talking about their neighborhood revitalization model. Knowledge Bites was started in 2017, and their goal is to provide high-level introduction to economic and workforce development programs, resources, and tools. These sessions are recorded, so people can watch them at a later date, and you can share with those who you think would be interested. The structure is about 20 to 30 minutes of a presentation and then some Q&A after. Again, this is recorded and will be archived on this web address here, brattleborodevelopment.com/knowledgebites. I'm going to go ahead and transfer it over to Paul, and he's going to tell us about his organization and all the great work they're doing in Oswego.
Hi, Sarah. I just want to make sure that I'm coming through.
Yep, I can see your screen. You look good.
Okay, thanks for having me. As Sarah said, my name is Paul Stewart. I am from Oswego, New York, a small city in upstate New York. I'm also the director of the Oswego Renaissance Association, a grassroots nonprofit organization that has been involved in a market-based revitalization strategy for the city of Oswego since 2013. I'm going to talk today about what we're doing, the strategy that we use, and why I think this is a very important and unique way to approach revitalization that is very successful and can be duplicated in other communities. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about something called the Healthy Neighborhoods approach to revitalization, which was begun by David Belke in the 1990s and is particularly suited to so-called weak markets like Oswego, New York, and others where communities that have experienced population loss and decline, and how to turn that around. So why don't we get started? Oswego, New York is a small post-industrial community of about 18,000 people on the shores of Lake Ontario, the southeast shore. In upstate New York. This is a community that was built at its peak for a population of about 25,000 people at our peak, and following globalization and industrial decline, the community has struggled like so many others over the last 30, 40 years, and the population has dwindled by roughly 20% and is now down to about 18,000, as I pointed out earlier. And the effects of that population decline and economic loss are evident in our community like so many other Rust Belt communities that have struggled in the modern era. If you go down into the streets of our community, you will see that we have many neighborhoods that are very strong and are healthy, and people are happy to live there, and they're fairly stable. But nearby you can have so-called transitional neighborhoods that look more or less fine if you're driving by them at 20 miles an hour, but for reasons that we'll talk about later, might be an important insertion point for revitalization. But more concern, or more disturbingly, is the presence of very frank, distressed neighborhoods that over the last 3 decades have begun to grow and spread throughout our community. And the challenge here is very real, because in the case example of the 3 slides I just showed, this particular street here, West 5th Street in Oswego, New York, is literally right around the corner from this street, literally within a stone's throw of each other. And over the last 30 years, this block has been losing ground, blocks like this, and blocks like these have been gaining ground. Now, if any of you live in a post-industrial community that has lost population and struggled, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that despite everything we've done for the last 30, 40 years, this continues to be a growing problem that affects the local economy, affects your downtown retail, and the entire fabric of your community. So this is a real problem that the ORA of my organization sought to begin to address in 2013. What do we do about this problem, and how can it be resolved? Part of the challenge here is defining what problem you're trying to solve. And for the last 40 years, problems like these have typically centered around affordable housing strategies, such as the creation of affordable housing through state and federal grants, and giving aid to homeowners to engage in assistance for repair and upgrades of their homes. And yet, after 4 decades of that approach, it's clear it has not been working. Neighborhood distress continues to slowly grow. People have been leaving slowly every year, so the population continues to drop, and confidence in the community had been eroding throughout that period of time. I'm going to skip a lot of history to get to the real point of the way we approach the problem of the weak market in the city of Oswego as a problem to solve of low market confidence and weak market demand. And what do I mean by those things? When you have a community like Oswego, when it has lost population, when housing values have declined as a result of lower demand for living in there, and more neighborhoods like this begin to appear, people start to lose confidence that it makes sense to invest in a community like this, quite understandably so. In a weak market like Oswego, New York, where property values are declining and people are leaving, that's a signal that we have too few willing buyers, which results in low and declining values. In the case of Oswego, New York, if you look at the population of the surrounding communities over the last 30 years in the county, that's grown somewhat over the last 3 to 4 decades. But the population within the city has declined. And that tells you an important piece of information, that people have been choosing to live outside our community but not live in it. And what underlies that weak market demand? And we hold that that has something to do with low market confidence. Let me give you a couple examples of that. First of all, in terms of people who have choices where they can live, if you indeed can choose whether to live inside or outside of a city, you're not going to choose to live in a neighborhood that is like this or close to this if you have other choices elsewhere. And so part of that is why we have too few willing buyers, because the signals that our neighborhoods have been sending have been very negative. The other component of this is the market confidence of the people that do live in this community, which is, I think, the most important leverage point for revitalization. We did an econometric analysis with a consulting firm, CCB, out of Alexandria in 2013 of our markets in Oswego, New York. And we found that every year, annually, when you took into account our housing costs and our economic base and our incomes, that about $23 million per year in aggregate by the citizens of Oswego was not being invested in their homes and their blocks. Money that in any healthy housing market they could plainly afford to invest, but they were choosing not to. And the question becomes then, why not? Why was this not happening? And it relates to one of my favorite quotes from Charles Buki, a colleague at CZB out of Alexandria, that said to me, confidence is the currency that all neighborhoods trade on. And essentially, to make it short, in markets like Oswego or other communities that have lost population and neighborhoods are declining, people are not feeling that it's a place they can be confident to invest in, and so that they don't. So that makes a big important difference between whether or not people have the ability to invest versus the willingness to do so. In a community like Oswego, New York, we plainly have the willingness to invest, but we did not have the confidence that it made sense to do so given the prevailing conditions in our community. So what can we do about that? Okay, how can we change conditions so that people become confident to invest in a community like ours, grow its value, and begin to turn that community around, and hopefully in a sustained long-term strategy of reinvestment and value building that can turn this community around in a sustainable way? And so I want to talk about what the ORA is doing that I think is unique, how we've solved this problem, and what our results are. The first thing I want to say about this is related to perhaps the most important part of our strategy, which is to build on strengths. In too many cases, traditional community development models don't embrace this approach, but rather they try to fix weaknesses. The typical approach is to say, we need to do something about these blocks like this, and until we fix these blocks, we can't get anything done. And that is a strategy around looking for the worst blocks and dealing with them, the most distressed areas, usually with too few dollars and not enough resources to leverage enough confidence to leverage private investment. We took a very different approach in the city of Oswego and chose a strategy that builds on strengths and asked the case, what if we did something very different to traditional approaches and focused our investment not in the areas, at least at first, of greatest distress, but in areas where we can get a market foothold and grow our housing market from the inside out. So in 2013, we looked at an econometric mapping of our community, and this is a map of a conditions analysis of our community that shows where the market is working well and where the housing market is struggling. The areas in green here are typically very healthy, strong neighborhoods where the market is working, people are staying, and generally there's no problem, no need for intervention. At the other end of the spectrum, we have, in red, severely distressed areas where no buyer with a choice would choose to buy into those neighborhoods. So they don't receive a lot of outside private investment. They're usually recipients of public investment to some extent, usually in insufficient amounts. And these places remain struggling, and they begin to spread. But in between these two areas are these so-called transitional markets that you see in yellow here. These are areas that are neither the strongest areas nor the weakest areas. They are your so-called transitional areas that are somewhat in between, which I'm going to refer to here forward as middle markets. If you look at transitional neighborhoods like this, when you drive by them quickly at 20 or 30 miles an hour, they seem just fine. But they are not necessarily. If you look closer, you can see that on blocks like these, the neighbors live near houses like this one that are beginning to creep into their block, and they're beginning to lose confidence that it makes sense to invest in places like these. And we argue that these blocks, these so-called middle markets, these transitional neighborhoods, are the places where you want to intervene with strategies first. In our 2013 neighborhood market analysis, we identified originally 4 and now 5 so-called middle markets like this, where we have clear assets, a high proportion of owner occupancy, generally filled with your salt of the earth working families that are still out there mowing the grass and painting their houses, but they're losing confidence because they see blight headed their way, and they're not sure it's going to make sense to stay. And if we invest in these blocks, we can likely, in partnership with the residents there, turn them around at a price that will pale in comparison if we wait till after those blocks have tipped. And our approach here is to begin in these so-called stronger areas, invest, grow value, grow the confidence of the market, and then spiral in a virtuous cycle of investment outward from these initial seed points. Another way I like to say it is we get ahead of the creeping blight rather than behind it. What is it that we do? Well, once you identify these so-called middle markets, there's lots of strategies that a city and nonprofit organizations and development corporations can implement in these areas. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but give sort of 3 major things we should consider, and then we'll talk about one in particular that we do that's having some fairly robust outcomes. The most important thing to understand is job number 1 is to really leverage individual homeowner investment, that is leverage private investment. We use programs like the Renaissance Block Challenge Grant, which I will talk about, but we have to understand something. Typically, there is not enough money, even on these so-called transitional blocks, to make a significant impact if you're just going to rely on public sources of funding. We need to find ways so that it will make sense for the people that live there now to begin leveraging their own resources and turn those blocks around. Because the truth is, blocks become healthy, they grow or decline on the basis of individual homeowners' choices and communities' choices, not really as a result of government interventions. What does the market want? And we want to align factors so that the market chooses to invest in these areas. On the municipal side, there are things that the city can do we can talk about, but in these so-called areas, if you're going to prioritize these so-called middle markets, you're going to begin to pour a lot of resources into these areas in particular, allocate resources for park beautification, blight removal, get police out on foot doing traditional community policing rather than staying in their hermetically sealed vehicles, get a DPW to not just maintain streets and do minimal maintenance, but engage in beautification and value building in these seed areas. And just as importantly, if not more importantly, in these target zones, these middle markets, you want to implement initiatives to generate resident involvement. Resident leadership development is critical because everything that this market-oriented approach centers around is the people in this picture making decisions by themselves that it makes sense to reinvest in these areas and grow them from the inside out. So the people you see in this lower picture are your staff. They are your army. They are the primary stakeholders of the community that will make or break whether these blocks succeed or not. So I'm going to talk about how it is that we do that, and I'm going to use the flagship example of the Renaissance Block Challenge Grant Program. Now, this is a program that you can learn the details of, but the reason I like to talk about it is because in its details, it essentially captures all the elements that I just described earlier about leveraging private investment, growing the confidence of neighbors, building the leadership in these blocks so that the neighbors take control of the future of those blocks and turn them around in a sustainable way with real skin in the game. The Renaissance Block Challenge Grant is a very simple approach. Typically, what we look for in these middle markets is we find blocks where we have families that live, and we tell them we have modest amounts of money that we're willing to grant to your block, up to $1,000 in a one-to-one matching grant. For each one of the homeowners on that block, we're willing to match you for exterior home improvement investments. But the rule is you have to get a minimum of 5 households on your same block to participate, forming a cluster. And because our grants are typically competitive, where we get many more applicants than we can fund, we typically look for blocks where it's not just 5 houses on the block, but 10 or 15 houses on that block, where you get a real critical mass of residents who are willing to explore an opportunity to begin reinvesting in that block. So initially, people are motivated by an opportunity to get a small amount of matching funds to improve their homes. But you have to remember, these are the same people that have been losing confidence that it makes sense to invest. So how do we get around this problem? Well, because of the nature of the way we engage in the community, if you're going to be part of this program, we typically have all these people in a neighborhood that are applying gathered together in a living room or a kitchen in one of the people's homes in that block. We meet with them for several hours and talk about how we can partner with them going forward through matching grants. We talk about our philosophy of building from their neighborhood outward. And we also talk about what the real problem to solve is. And rather than worrying about what is wrong with the neighborhood, what is broken about the community, what can they start building that is working right? And I would be lying if I said the magic happens in just one meeting. But to some extent, a great deal is accomplished in that first meeting and in subsequent engagements with them over time. When these neighbors who historically have had no partnership and have felt alone, when they get together with all the neighbors in their block and they realize everyone else across that table has the same goals they have and everyone else is willing to begin reinvesting, it begins to make sense for them to begin reinvesting as well. Now they have the confidence that, okay, if everyone else is in, then we're going to be in too, and we're going to move forward as a group to take control of the future of our neighborhood and more broadly our community. And we do this in dozens of blocks every year. Let's talk about how this has panned out and where it's been and where it's going. So in 2014, we initially started a flagship project where we had about $86,000 in grants to these 12 or so different blocks in the city of Oswego, and our target areas were between 5 and 15 households on each block were willing to participate. In that year, although we granted out about $86,000, the residents themselves invested $316,000, and that was a level of investment, even collectively, that had not been seen in many years. And the blocks began to improve, in some cases, really notably so because of the compound focus we have, the concentrated investment on specific blocks. When other blocks saw what was happening, the following year it spread. And in another 15 or so blocks also participated with a similar investment yield. And if you move through from 2014 to 15, then to 16 and 17 to 2018 and 2019, you can begin to see the participation and this entire movement of building value in our neighborhoods growing. And while this is happening, not only are the neighborhoods investing, the neighbors they're investing, but they're also threaded together socially, and they are gaining confidence to reinvest year over year because now things are starting to make sense. It's becoming a community that they're proud of, that they want to be in. And we'll talk about how that plans out at the end. So I want to show you two things, some very fun, frankly, pictures of some of the houses and people and how things have turned around on these blocks to give you a visual sense of what's happened. Then I want to talk about some data that have shown how successful we have been on the market side. So these are a few examples. I have hundreds of pictures like these, but we'll go through it. This is one of the houses I showed you earlier on one of these transitional middle market blocks. This is that house today. Similarly, across the street on the other side, this was a house that was a sort of semi-abandoned business office that wasn't used too much, bought by a family that moved in from Connecticut and saw the improvements in these neighborhoods and wanted to be a part of it. Just down the street, this was a distressed site. We used to call it the Cyclops house in this particular neighborhood. Someone saw this house, saw what was going on. When everyone else was investing in that neighborhood, they made the decision to reinvest and turn their house around. And this is not just an isolated house or two. We have hundreds of cases like this, like Adam and Joe Fay, from large changes to small changes like Trinity Engel on East 7th Street, who made some substantial changes to her house right there. Whether we're on East 4th Street and this family, investments small and large begin to incrementally transform these blocks. I'll just go through a few quickly. A house on East 6th Street and what's happened. Even small houses and people that struggle, lower income areas, they can participate as well. Our matching grants are scaled. But when other people are investing on these blocks, people really feel good about where they are and begin reinvesting sometimes in profound ways. And I could go on and on. I mean, if we want to talk about and give some more examples of these, but it's just a lot of fun to see these changes that have occurred in these blocks, from old historic houses to even modern ranch houses, and watch the pride and enthusiasm for living in this community grow. One of my particular favorites is this old Tudor house, where the neighbors there, when all the other neighbors around them were investing, decided, well, it makes sense to invest here. And this used to be sort of a par for the course house in our community. It's now owned by a family that are very proud of where they live. And in each one of these cases, or at least most of them, these sorts of examples only cost us about $1,000, but the neighbors are spending $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to invest. It isn't just the individual homeowners that are investing either. This kind of building on strengths revitalization movement that produces these visible results also leverages other kinds of investment. For example, the house I showed you on that traditional street was really a rental, and the private developer decided, because of what was happening in the community, he was going to rehab this into what used to be a troubled house to now a higher-end rental that is lived in by professionals. In this particular case here, on our first or second year of activity, this was a a old sorority house that was in danger of abandonment. And the neighbors on that block, because of the momentum that occurred, collectively 20 of them bought that house out as a collective and rehabbed that house. That's a picture of all of them. It was around 2015. I called them micro developers and worked on that house, hired contractors for about a year, and now that is a very proud single-family house that used to be a real source of problems in the neighborhood, and is now one of the neighborhood's greatest strengths. And notwithstanding, we don't just work with neighbors on households. We have neighbors that improve their streets, engage in park improvements, all the things that make a community a healthy place that people want to see occur in their neighborhoods. So showing the outcomes of this kind of thing is fun. Certainly the houses look better. I'm telling you that the neighbors are more involved, that confidence is growing. Does this have a true and lasting impact economically, and how do we know it's going to be sustainable? Is there just a one-shot thing, or does it sustain? And we have evidence that tells us it's very likely to sustain, and here's why. One thing I would point out is that over the last year we have seen investment grow. So for example, in 2014 we had 96 homes where we put out about $85,000 in matching grants, and as I said earlier, the homeowners themselves invested about $319,000. If you flash forward through all these different years, 2015, 16, 17, 18 to last year, we're now up to 180 homes per year, and typically over $500,000 is invested every year in these blocks. We've now gotten into over 6 blocks, and in 6 years we've leveraged over $3.25 million in private capital in these neighborhoods, over 700 households, and most of that money is coming from the community itself. It's not coming from state or federal sources. It is private investment because people are saying they're willing to put their skin back in the game. But beyond that, there's two additional important points of information that tell us we're headed in the right direction. And one of them is what I call reverse conversions, where private individuals have bought former rental properties and converted them back to owner occupation. In one of our longest running Renaissance block target zones in the northwest quadrant of the city, this is a map of that area of the city. It's used a Google map, and in green, all these small houses, whether they're light or dark green, are properties that have participated in our programs for 1 year or multiple years, because we work with them for multiple years. About 2/3 of those circled properties are former rental properties and or non-family properties that were rehabbed and bought by single families to occupy, and some of those rehabs have been profound. We have not seen that kind of activity in years or in memory. The other thing I want to talk about is what's happened to housing values in this area. I'm going to show you some data that shows that housing values have grown, but I want to give a bit of contextual information. We are not involved in this program to make housing more expensive. However, the problem to solve for a community like Oswego really is the low market demand and people that are leaving our community. We need to turn that around so that we increase market demand and people choose to move in and invest in our community. If our community becomes such that it becomes healthy and it becomes a place where it makes sense to invest, then people from the outside will come in, buy homes, and drive the market. And if that's what happens, you would expect our low and declining housing values to stabilize and then rise in a healthy way, not a meteoric way, but in a healthy way that reflects a market that is healthy and growing at a reasonable pace. In this target zone, our longest running target zone, we just collected the last 6 years of data since 2013 on the housing values, the average housing values in blue on the Renaissance blocks that we have worked in from 2013 to 2018. And in green, blocks in that same neighborhood that we have not yet worked with. On the y-axis is the mean home sales price. On the x-axis is the year since 2013, so 1 is 2013, whereas 6 is 2018. The numbers in parentheses are the number of home sales that year on those two different types of blocks, the blocks we've worked with and the blocks we have not worked with. And we see a statistically significant increase in home sales, in the value at sales, in the value at sale for houses on a Renaissance blocks, about a 25% rise in just 6 years, which frankly in the city of Oswego is fairly unheard of. In contrast, in the blocks that we have not worked with yet in that same neighborhood, we see a more traditional trajectory we'd seen in the past with flat or declining values. This tells us that we are in fact growing demand because housing values are a proxy for demand. I'm going to close and open this up for some questions, but I just want to make some concluding remarks. This is not just an approach that simply is contained within the blocks we work with. The enthusiasm and the confidence in the community-wide begins to spread throughout the whole city. This whole approach of trying to build value and build what's working rather than trying to fix what's broken is an ethos that is beginning to change the entire culture of our community. We had a new mayor, the youngest mayor in the state of New York, William Barlow, elected, I believe it was in 2015, that also saw the value in this approach and begun to work with our downtown and our neighborhoods to begin revitalizing the city from the inside out as well. It started with small things like these lights on the bridge that used to not be there, that was initially started by residents. Now the city maintains these things and is engaged in a full downtown revitalization activity to this day. In fact, in 2016, our city applied for a downtown revitalization initiative and won a $10 million grant from the state of New York based on what we had shown progress-wise in the years before. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say if that opportunity to apply for that downtown revitalization grant had come up years ago, I would have been surprised if the city would have even applied. So in addition to the work in our neighborhoods, we're seeing upper floor reuse, rehabilitation of our downtown going on, and there's a general and palpable sense in the community and even regionally that Oswego is in a state of incremental transformation for the better. But where this really starts, and we need to understand, is this is not an approach that starts from the top down. The reason it has worked and it is working is because we engaged from the bottom up, the neighbors themselves at a grassroots level, because what is frequently misunderstood is that it is the neighbors, the residents, that are our primary stakeholders in the mutual stock that is a community. And it is their investment and their private decisions to invest or disinvest, to stay or to leave, that makes or breaks where a city goes. So our neighbors lead. It starts from the grassroots with modest amounts of money that is amplified by their investment decisions, and it blossoms from there. And as I've always said to them, and I say to communities like ours, this is something I encourage you to do, and it's something where your neighbors want to be involved, because unless it is the neighbors who care an awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So thank you for listening and looking at our story at Oswego, New York, and I hope this has been informative.
Thank you so much, Paul. We actually, while you were presenting, we had the planning director for the town of Brattleboro, Sue, join us.
Hi.
I just unmuted her. Sue, if you have any questions, please feel free.
I do have a question, and I fear you may have covered this in the first couple of slides that I missed. Can you tell me where your funding came from, your initial funding?
Yeah, so our primary source of funding is the Richard S. Shinneman Foundation, which is a private foundation that came to be actually a year before we started 2012. And they're a philanthropic foundation that around in 2012 had about $1 million a year that they had in funding capacity, although I think it's increased since then. And they fund us at $150,000 per year. In addition to that, we have, and we've grown this major local corporate funder. So Pathfinder Bank is another one at about $25,000 a year, and now Shinneman is engaged in a matching process with us, so we're growing a lot of local corporate support. But 100% of it is really private foundations or corporate.
Okay. That would seem to make sense for a program like this.
Yeah, and if you think about it, this whole program runs at about $175,000 to $200,000 per year. If you compare that to a budget for a typical community development office as part of a municipality, that's nothing. I mean, the changes that we've leveraged in just 5 or 6 years with that amount of money is something we hadn't seen in the prior 40 years with, I would argue, millions of dollars invested using the older traditional community development strategies.
Another question, and again, I'm sorry if I missed it. Are you just doing outside beautification, or are you doing kind of code improvements on these buildings? I mean, what is the scope of what people can apply for?
Okay. So the answer is we're doing outside improvements, and I want to talk about why. The strategy that we're employing is to change the nature of the housing market itself and the signals our community sends. It's actually a lot deeper than it sounds. It's not just about money or housing value, but we want the people that live here to feel that this is a good place to live, who become invested. We also want to attract other people to live here. And as I was saying to you in the first half of this presentation, the signals that our blocks have been sending have been signals that have reduced confidence that it makes sense to invest in a community like ours. And so we focus on exterior beautification so that the blocks become stronger places where people, they're seen as strong. It sends a very different signal to the neighbors within it and without it. I would say that what that then leverages, though, is that when people start to realize their block around them is a place that is becoming a good place to live, that will then incentivize larger scale interior investments in housing overhauls. For just one example, if you look at this graph here in our Renaissance blocks, if you look back in 2013, when you get housing values that start to get down that low, many times you can't even get a loan for enough, and there's not enough equity in the house to engage in major interior improvements. But when the housing values get healthy, we start to catalyze those sorts of activities. And what I didn't spend a lot of time talking about is when I talk about a lot of these circles here, which are major rehabs, they're not just improving the outside of their house. That's what we're funding. But what we're really leveraging is their confidence to invest. They can control the inside of their house, but they're more willing to do those things if the block itself is a place where it makes sense to invest.
Okay.
Great. So are there any other questions that you have for Paul?
I don't have any other questions at this time.
Okay.
I really appreciate this presentation. We're definitely dealing with trying to figure out what the housing market, what's going on with the housing market here in Brattleboro. So I just appreciate that.
I did see Brattleboro. I did talk extensively with Sarah Lang about it. It's not exactly the same market as ours, but one of the things when I saw it, it reminded me very much of Oswego, New York, although in some ways different, but I see a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
So do you feel like this is something that would make sense for Brattleboro, or are you, sort of what's your opinion as far as how this model could potentially fit into our town?
Yeah, I definitely do think there's benefits of it. I was asking about the interior because some of the feedback, some of the feedback that we're getting is that our housing stock is old and that it's hard for people, new buyers, to even get loans to buy the house because they need such upgrades or so many upgrades. So some of the funding sources actually won't make the loans to them. And so, yeah, but I think that some of the exterior and improving neighborhoods, I think it is relevant. We have a group that is getting together to talk about kind of what is our housing situation, and it does include some private, the banks are involved and lots of different organizations. So I think we're at the start of trying to figure out where the bottlenecks are in our market.
Could I interject in that?
Yeah.
I don't know the context of that conversation, but we heard that statement in Oswego, New York, that our house is too old and we need something new and fresh. And I usually find that hasn't really thought through the issue very well when that comes up.
Okay.
I mean, houses in Saratoga Springs, New York, are just as old as ours. Mostly peaked in the 19th century, and there are not problems funding the rehab of those houses. I mean, let alone other places like Skinny Atlas. I mean, the age of the housing in upstate New York itself is not so much the issue. The question in terms of whether you get a bank loan is whether or not there's likely to be a return on that bank loan's investment.
Yeah.
And so if it's a strong area that people want to move into, then that's going to drive a lot of investment decisions that move the blocks where it becomes feasible to do that. I've always said, I mean, distressed neighborhoods don't become strong neighborhoods because a bank does something or because a government does something. If you look throughout the state, the United States, whether you're talking about Greenwich Village, whether you're talking about Soho, whether you're talking about communities that have really changed dramatically in the last in our history, they're usually driven by the individuals there that decide to turn their community to something that's great. That's how what I have seen as some of the most strong examples of distressed areas that make a comeback.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And Sue, as I had mentioned to you, I believe on Friday, we're trying to do sort of multiple things with Paul. One of them being this, hopefully sometime, this spring or summer, get Paul out to Southern Vermont. And so, we're trying to incorporate him as much as possible because I think this is a good example. And even if the model isn't specifically correct for our communities, I think a lot of the underlying, foundational stuff that Paul has included in this organization is really important for people to hear.
I agree. I think it would be really exciting if he could come speak here. I'm disappointed that there aren't more people on here, so I'm hoping this is taped so that we can spread it as well.
Yep. Yeah, so this is recorded, and, I'll post it up on our website and on Facebook so we can share it widely.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Okay.